Hey, welcome back. So I was just reading this piece about Russia and its neighbors, and it totally flipped my perspective on what's happening since the invasion of Ukraine.
Oh, you mean the Alexander Cooley article? It's fascinating because it challenges that Western idea that Russia's totally isolated now.
Exactly. I thought everyone in the post-Soviet space would be running for the hills, terrified they'd be next. But it turns out it's complicated.
Complicated is an understatement. While the West expected these countries to denounce Moscow, most have actually stayed pragmatically neutral. They're not just scared, they're deeply entwined.
Wait, so instead of pulling away, they're actually deepening ties. That sounds counterintuitive.
It really is. Cooley calls it a hidden empire. Putin has spent decades building these formal and informal networks, like the Eurasian Economic Union and the CSTO, that make it really hard to just break up.
So it's not just about a shared history. It's like they've built this whole infrastructure that keeps them locked together.
Right, and it's not just about Russia forcing them. Many of these states see a massive economic benefit. Take the labor market. Over 3 million Central Asian migrants are working in Russia right now.
That's a huge number. But what about the Russians leaving? I heard a lot of tech people fled the country when the war started.
Oh, that's one of the most interesting parts. About 100,000 Russian IT workers moved to places like Armenia and Georgia. It actually transformed those economies almost overnight.
Wait, are you serious? How much could a few thousand techies really do?
Check this out. Armenia's GDP grew by nearly 13% in 2022. 13! Mostly because their tech sector expanded by 20% thanks to those Russian specialists.
No way. That's insane growth for a small country.
Exactly, but it's a double-edged sword. In Georgia, it caused a housing crisis and some social tension because so many Russians suddenly moved in.
I can imagine. But let's talk about the sanctions. I thought the whole point was to cut Russia off from global trade. How's that working if they're still buddies with their neighbors?
Well, that's where it gets a bit gray market. These post-Soviet trade networks have become massive channels for sanctions evasion.
Like, they're smuggling stuff in?
Basically, there's this wild report that Central Asian states were importing EU appliances, like washing machines and fridges, stripping the microchips out of them, and then shipping those chips to Russia.
You're kidding. They're literally gutting refrigerators for parts to send to Moscow?
Yup. And the trade numbers back it up. Kazakhstan's computer imports jumped 7-fold in 1 year. They're clearly not using all those laptops themselves.
That is wild. It's like a giant game of shell companies and re-exports.
And it's not just computers. Georgia's car exports to Kyrgyzstan surged, and then those cars miraculously end up in Russia. It's a whole legal architecture designed to bypass the West.
So Moscow's influence isn't just about trade, it's about political control too, right? I saw something about these countries adopting similar laws to Russia.
Precisely. Putin is exporting his authoritarian playbook. Kyrgyzstan and Georgia both recently passed these foreign agent laws that look a lot like Russia's, targeting NGOs that get money from abroad.
Even with the protests in Georgia, I remember seeing people in the streets.
Yeah, the protests were huge, but the law passed anyway. It's causing a lot of friction with the EU, which is exactly what Moscow wants. It keeps these countries from drifting too far west.
It feels like Russia has a tighter grip than we realize. But what about China? Aren't they moving into Central Asia and stepping on Russia's toes?
You'd think so, but the author argues that Russia is actually accommodating China. They're basically teaming up to counter what they call U.S. hegemony.
So it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation.
Exactly. Moscow accepts China's economic lead in Central Asia because they need Beijing as a strategic partner. It's a calculated trade-off.
This whole thing makes it seem like Western policy is kind of out of touch, like we're offering them a choice they don't want to make.
That's Cooley's main point. He says the West needs to stop seeing it as zero-sum. We shouldn't force these states to pick a side, because right now, Russia's networks are just too deep to ignore.
So instead of saying it's us or them, we should just help them build their own autonomy.
Right, give them breathing room to navigate the mess without demanding they cut all ties to Moscow, which they probably can't even do if they wanted to.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. It really makes you realize how much the hidden parts of an empire actually matter. Thanks for breaking this down.
Anytime. It's a fascinating look at how power actually works on the ground.
So I was catching up on that foreign affairs piece about Central Asia, and it really made me rethink the whole Russia versus China rivalry narrative.
Right? Everyone wants to call it a scramble for the region, like it's the 19th century all over again. But the reality is way more subtle than that.
Exactly. Like that massive summit in Xi'an. Xi Jinping basically threw an Olympic-sized party for these 5 Central Asian leaders. It looked like a total power move against Moscow.
It definitely had that vibe. But if you look closer, it's not like Beijing is trying to kick Russia out. It's more like Russia is becoming the junior partner in this really asymmetrical relationship.
Wait, junior partner? That sounds like a bit of a demotion for Putin, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. But in Central Asia specifically, Russia is still the dominant force. They've been the hegemon there for centuries, and they're not just going to pack up and leave because China has more cash.
But the influence is shifting, right? I saw that in Kazakhstan, for the first time ever, more people actually disapprove of Russia's influence than approve. That's a huge shift.
It is. The war in Ukraine has definitely stained the brand. But look at what the leaders do, not just the polls. A week before that fancy China summit, all 5 of those leaders were in Moscow for the Victory Day parade.
No way. They actually stood there with Putin while the war was raging?
Yeah, it's a pragmatic play. They know the West won't punish them for a parade, but they have no idea how Putin would react if they snubbed him. He's still the guy who could make life very difficult for them.
Like with the pipelines? I read something about Russia shutting down Kazakh oil exports for technical reasons whenever Kazakhstan gets a little too independent.
Exactly. The Caspian pipeline runs right through Russian territory. It's a massive lever. And it's not just oil. It's bread and sugar, too. When Russia banned farmer exports at the start of the war, it sent inflation through the roof across the region.
So they're literally holding the grocery list.
Pretty much. Plus, you have over 10 million Central Asian migrants working in Russia. Their remittances are the backbone of some of these economies.
Okay, so Russia has the economic and physical levers, but what about the vibes? Is it still a cultural connection?
Totally. The article describes it as a club of gray-haired men who grew up in the Soviet Union. They speak the same language, they think about power the same way. It's a deep-seated trust that China just doesn't have yet.
It's like an old boys club. But China is bringing some serious money to the table, right? $70 billion in trade versus Russia's $40 billion? That's not small change.
It's massive. But here's the kicker. China's growth isn't actually hurting Russia. Most of what China buys is commodities that Russia already has plenty of, so they aren't even competing for the same exports.
Oh, that's a great point. They're filling different niches. So is there any friction on the security side? I always figured Russia wanted to be the only one with boots on the ground.
That's the traditional view, but it's changing. Russia still has the military bases and the security umbrella, but China's starting to experiment. They've actually set up paramilitary bases in Tajikistan to monitor the Afghan border.
And Russia is cool with that? They don't see it as trespassing?
Surprisingly, yeah. Moscow seems to see it as burden sharing now. They're both terrified of jihadists or instability from Afghanistan spilling over, so they're actually coordinating.
It sounds less like a rivalry and more like a tag team effort to keep the West out.
That's exactly what it is. Their top priority, both of them, is keeping these authoritarian regimes stable and making sure the U.S. doesn't get a foothold.
It's wild how much they're willing to overlook to maintain that status quo. But what about the Central Asian countries themselves? Are they just stuck in the middle?
They're actually getting better at playing the game. They don't want to be 100% dependent on Russia, but they don't want to be 100% dependent on China either. They're hedging, as the experts say.
Right, like support Putin enough to keep the oil flowing, but embrace China enough to keep the investment coming.
Exactly, and all while keeping a foot in the door with the West. It's a high-stakes balancing act, but it's working for them for now.
So the loss of grip headline is maybe a bit dramatic. Russia's grip is just changing shape.
Yeah, the grip might be a little looser, but the hand is still very much on the shoulder. China is just the guy standing next to them now, and they've realized they're both heading in the same direction.
Man, the complexity of this stuff is never as simple as the headlines make it out to be.
Never is, especially when you have decades of history and billions of dollars in the mix.
All right, so next topic. I want to talk about Central Asia. It's one of those regions I feel like we only hear about in passing, but the situation there right now is wild because of the war in Ukraine.
Oh, it's fascinating. We're talking about the 5 stands: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. They're basically in this impossible geopolitical squeeze right now.
I mean, they were all part of the Soviet Union, right? So they have these deep, deep ties to Russia. It's like having a roommate who suddenly decides to start a fight with everyone on the block.
Exactly. And for the longest time, Russia was the big brother security guarantor. But now these countries are realizing they can't put all their eggs in that basket anymore.
Wait, so are they actually breaking up with Russia or just seeing other people?
It's more like a complicated relationship status. They haven't endorsed the invasion at all. In fact, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have been pretty vocal about supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity.
No way.
That's actually a huge deal considering how much land Kazakhstan shares with Russia. I saw here that Kazakhstan is like 4 times the size of Texas.
It's massive, and they're pursuing what they call a multi-vector foreign policy. Basically, they're trying to be friends with Russia, China, the US, and the EU all at once, so they don't get swallowed by any of them.
But how does that work when Russia has military bases in half of these countries? I think it was Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Yeah, and Kazakhstan too. Plus, they have the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's like Russia's version of NATO. It actually deployed troops to Kazakhstan just a month before the Ukraine war started to help with some internal unrest.
Wait, seriously? So Russia saves the government in January, and then in February, the government is like, hey, we're not supporting your war. That must have been an awkward phone call.
Right? It's a total tightrope walk. They're even sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine while still technically being in a military alliance with Russia.
What about the actual people living there? Are they as torn as the governments, or are they picking sides?
It's really divided. Like in Kyrgyzstan, one poll showed about 86% still have a favorable view of Russia. But when you ask who's responsible for the war, the answers are all over the place.
I saw some stats. 14% in Kyrgyzstan blame Russia, but 36% blame Ukraine? That's wild. The Russian media presence there must be huge.
It is. Russia's media footprint is massive. But interestingly, in Kazakhstan, the younger generation is way more likely to support Ukraine. So there's this real generational shift happening.
Okay, let's talk about the money side of this. If you're landlocked and your main trade routes go through Russia, how do you not go down with the ship when the sanctions hit?
That's the big headache. Their currencies usually move in tandem with the ruble. When the ruble crashed initially, the tenge and the som took a hit too.
Ugh, that's brutal. Like, your currency loses value just because your neighbor is getting sanctioned?
Exactly. And it's not just the currency. They rely on Russia for everything from iron and steel to refrigerators and margarine.
Wait, margarine? That's such a specific thing to be worried about in a geopolitical crisis.
Hey, supply chains are real, but the real concern is wheat. Russia and Ukraine are the world's breadbasket. When the war started, Russia briefly banned grain exports to the region, and it sent everyone into a panic about food security.
So what are they doing? Are they building new roads or something?
Basically, they're looking for transit routes that bypass Russia entirely. They want to get their resources to Europe through Azerbaijan and Turkey instead.
That sounds expensive and like it would take forever to build. In the meantime, is the U.S. actually doing anything there, or are we just watching?
We're trying. There's this C5+1 platform where the U.S. Secretary of State meets with all 5 of their foreign ministers. Antony Blinken actually went to Astana and Tashkent recently.
Wait, I remember reading about something called Jackson-Vanik. It sounded like a 1970s law that's still hanging around.
It totally is. It's this Cold War-era amendment that still restricts trade relations with some of these countries because they used to be part of the Soviet Union. The Biden administration is actually trying to repeal it for Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan to help build closer ties.
Man, talk about outdated paperwork. But if we move in, doesn't that just annoy China? They're right there on the border, too.
Oh, China's the big player here. Some analysts think China's actually the one who's going to benefit most if Russia's influence fades. They're already pouring money in through the Belt and Road Initiative.
So Central Asia is like the prize in a tug-of-war between the U.S., Russia, and China.
More like a high-stakes balancing act. They have huge amounts of natural gas and rare earth minerals that everyone wants, but they have to be careful not to lean too far in one direction, or they'll fall.
It's crazy to think about. You're landlocked, your old ally is at war, and your new potential allies are halfway across the world. No wonder they're stressed.
Right. It's a region that's finally being seen for its own strategic value, not just as Russia's backyard. But the transition is, let's just say it's messy.
Okay, so I was looking into how the war in Ukraine is affecting Central Asia, and it's wild how much their banks are actually tied to Russia. Like, I didn't realize how deep it went.
Oh, it's massive. In Kazakhstan alone, before the invasion, 3 of their biggest banks were actually just subsidiaries of Russian giants like Sberbank and VTB. They're basically an extension of the Russian financial nervous system.
Wait, so if those Russian banks got sanctioned, what happened to the people in Kazakhstan who had money there?
It was chaos. Take Alpha Bank's subsidiary. There was a literal bank run. People were panicking, trying to pull their cash out before it was too late. Eventually, a local Kazakhstani bank just had to buy them out to stabilize things.
That's terrifying. Imagine waking up and your bank is suddenly an international pariah.
Exactly. And it's not just the big banks. A lot of these countries use Russia's version of SWIFT, called SPFS, to move money around. Russia built it after the 2014 sanctions to try and sanction-proof their influence.
So they're trying to build their own little financial bubble.
Exactly, but it's a struggle because SPFS isn't nearly as developed as the global systems. Plus, if you're trying to do anything in US dollars, those sanctions still make it nearly impossible.
But wait, I read somewhere that a ton of Russians are actually flocking to these countries now, like moving their money out of Russia into Kazakhstan?
Oh yeah, it's a total boom for local banks. Around 500,000 Russian citizens opened accounts in Kazakhstan in 2022 just to bypass sanctions. Uzbekistan even has bank tourism packages, where travel agencies help you with the paperwork and get you a debit card.
Wait, bank tourism? That is the most 2024 thing I've ever heard.
Right, but for the locals, it's a double-edged sword. While the banks are getting all this new business, the millions of Central Asian migrant workers in Russia are getting squeezed.
I was going to ask about that. Don't countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan basically survive on the money those workers send home?
Totally. We're talking over 30% of their entire GDP comes from remittances, mostly from Russia. The World Bank thought those payments would crater because of the war, but they actually hit record highs in 2022.
Wait, how? If Russia is under sanctions, how is more money going out?
It's a mix of a strong ruble at the time and a massive demand for labor. But, and this is a big but, the cost of sending that money home has spiked because the usual banking channels are blocked.
So even when they win, they lose. It sounds like a diplomatic nightmare for these governments, like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
It really is a balancing act. You have all 5 Central Asian presidents showing up to Putin's Victory Day parade in 2023, which some people saw as a survival strategy. They can't afford to alienate him.
But then you have the rhetoric coming out of Russia. Didn't some official call Kazakhstan an artificial state?
Yeah, that was on Dmitry Medvedev's social media. It was deleted quickly, and they claimed he was hacked. But the message was clear. It makes everyone in the region incredibly nervous.
I bet. If I were them, I'd be looking for the Exodore.
Well, that's exactly what's happening culturally. In Kazakhstan, there's this unprecedented surge in people wanting to learn the Kazakh language instead of just using Russian. It's like a wake-up call for their national identity.
That's a huge shift. What about the military side? I thought they were all in this security alliance together, the CSTO.
The CSTO is honestly looking pretty weak right now. One analyst even said it seems to be dying.
Seriously? Why?
Because it doesn't actually stop conflicts between its own members. In 2022, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, both members, had a border war that killed over 100 people, and the CSTO did nothing.
So the alliance meant to protect them can't even keep them from fighting each other. That's a bad look.
Exactly. And Russia is too distracted in Ukraine to mediate. They've even been pulling troops out of their bases in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to send them to the front lines.
Wow. So Russia's influence is physically shrinking in the region.
Physically, yes, but economically it's more complicated. Have you heard of the ghost trade?
No, that sounds ominous. What is it?
So the EU sends about $1 billion worth of goods, things like microchips and drones, to countries like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. But then those goods just vanish before they get there.
Wait, they vanish? You mean they're actually ending up in Russia?
Bingo! They use falsified customs declarations. It's a way for Russia to get dual-use items that have both civilian and military applications.
Man, the U.S. has to be furious about that. Are they going to slap sanctions on the Central Asian countries too?
The threat of secondary sanctions is very real. The U.S. Treasury already designated an Uzbekistan-based company for helping the Russian defense industry. It's a game of whack-a-mole.
It sounds like Kazakhstan is trying to fix it, though. I think I saw something about them monitoring re-exports.
They are. They started a new vetting system in 2023. For them, complying with sanctions isn't about politics, it's about economic self-preservation. They can't afford to get cut off from the West.
It's just crazy how this one war thousands of miles away is rewriting the entire identity and economy of Central Asia.
It really is. They're trying to maintain the right distance from Moscow, close enough to survive, but far enough not to go down with the ship.
Okay, so I was diving into this report on Central Asia, and the whole dynamic with Russia right now is it's a complete mess, honestly.
It really is. It's like this massive, complicated puzzle where the pieces don't even fit anymore. You have this huge migration flip-flop happening.
Right? Like usually we think of people from places like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan moving to Russia for work, right?
Exactly. Labor migration has always been the backbone of that relationship. But now Russia is trying to use those workers for the war in Ukraine. They're dangling fast-track citizenship and high salaries just to get them to enlist.
Wait, so if you're a migrant worker, you can basically skip the line for a passport if you pick up a rifle?
On paper, yeah, but the governments back in Central Asia are terrified. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan have been putting out these warnings, basically saying, hey, if you fight in a foreign war, it's a criminal offense. You'll go to jail when you come home.
No way. So they're caught between the Russian army trying to recruit them and their own government threatening them with prison?
Precisely. And some reports suggest it's not even a choice for everyone. Some of these guys are being coerced or just straight up misled into joining.
That is actually terrifying. But then, and this is the part that really got me, there's this whole other wave moving in the opposite direction.
Oh, you mean the exodus, the hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing into Central Asia to avoid the draft?
Yeah, I saw that over 200,000 Russians entered Kazakhstan in just a 2-week window after the mobilization was announced. That's a massive number of people hitting the border all at once.
It's wild. And the reception has been, well, mixed. On one hand, you have the presidents of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan saying they'll ensure the safety of these people. They're even trying to lure in the tech workers.
Right. Digital nomads welcome, but everyone else? I saw that rents in places like Almaty and Bishkek just skyrocketed.
Seriously, rents went through the roof. There were stories of local people being evicted because landlords wanted to charge the new Russian arrivals 5 times the price. It's creating this real humanitarian strain on the housing market.
I mean, it makes sense. If you suddenly have 50,000 people show up in a city looking for apartments, everything is going to break. But does this actually help their economies in the long run?
Some analysts think so. They see this influx of IT professionals and remote workers as a potential startup revolution for the region. But the public isn't totally sold. One poll in Kazakhstan showed nearly 40% of people weren't happy about the mass migration.
I can see why. It's a lot of change very fast. And it feels like the governments are starting to look elsewhere for friends too, right? Like they're tired of being so dependent on Russia.
Totally. They're diversifying, they're reaching out to the EU, Turkey, Iran, even India. They're trying to build what they call the Middle Corridor.
The Middle Corridor, is that like a trade route that just skips Russia entirely?
Exactly. It goes through Central Asia, across the Caspian Sea, through the Caucasus, and into Turkey. It's a way to connect China and Europe without having to deal with all the sanctions and headaches in Russia.
Wait, speaking of headaches, I read that Kazakhstan's oil pipeline through Russia has been accidentally interrupted like 4 times since the war started.
Yeah, accidentally. Most people see that as total retaliation because Kazakhstan wouldn't support the invasion. It's making them move even faster to find other ways to get their oil to the market.
So if Russia's influence is slipping, who's the big winner here? Is it China?
It looks that way. China's trade with the region has grown like 100 times over in the last 30 years. Xi Jinping made his first big post-COVID trip to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. That says a lot.
But do the people actually want China there? Because I saw some surveys saying the public perception is actually getting worse.
You hit the nail on the head. Even though the governments are signing all these big Belt and Road deals, the average person is pretty wary. There's concern about corruption, debt, and the treatment of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang.
It's such a delicate balancing act. They're trying to escape Russia's shadow, but they don't want to get swallowed up by China either.
Exactly. And in the middle of all this, China is starting to talk more about security cooperation, too. They're offering to train thousands of local law enforcement officers.
So they're moving from just being the bank to being the security guard for the region.
Slowly, yes, but they're being careful not to step on Russia's toes too much. It's this high-stakes game where everyone is trying to figure out who's actually in charge now.
Man, it's just crazy how much one conflict in Ukraine has completely rewired the map for these 5 countries.
It really has. It's like they're finally realizing they can't just rely on the old ways. They have to play the field.
Okay, so I was looking into Central Asia recently, and it's wild how much China has basically built their entire infrastructure.
Oh, for sure. Between 2008 and 2017 alone, China's major state banks poured something like $30.5 billion into projects across the C5 countries.
$30 billion? That's insane. What are they even building with that much cash?
It's mostly connectivity. We're talking oil and gas pipelines, railways, and industrial upgrades. They want to facilitate trade both within the region and directly back to China.
So it's like they're turning the whole region into one big transit hub. But I heard it's not just physical roads and pipes anymore.
Exactly. They're moving into the digital Silk Road. They're building surveillance networks, cloud storage, and even smart city platforms in places like Tashkent.
Wait, smart cities? That sounds like a lot of data control. Do the locals actually like this?
Actually, there's been some serious backlash. Data shows there were over 150 protests related to Chinese projects between 2019 and 2021. People are worried about land seizures and losing jobs to foreign workers.
That makes sense. I'd be suspicious, too, if a foreign power was building surveillance in my neighborhood. Is that where the U.S. comes in?
Well, the U.S. is trying. They launched the Arakan Initiative with $50 million to help diversify trade routes and bolster the private sector.
50 million compared to 30 billion? That's like bringing a toothpick to a sword fight.
Yeah, critics have said it's not exactly a serious gesture given the scale of what other powers are bringing to the table.
So what's the play then? If the U.S. can't outspend China, how do they engage?
One big hurdle is trade status. Most of these countries are still tied up in this old Cold War-era law called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which limits normal trade relations.
Wait, we're still using laws from the 70s? That seems counterproductive if we want to be their partners.
Right. The Biden administration is actually pushing to lift those requirements for Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan to fix that.
It always comes back to the geography, doesn't it? But they have more than just gas, right? I read something about minerals.
Oh, big time. Central Asia is being called a new hotspot for mineral extraction. They have almost all the critical materials needed for clean energy tech.
Like rare earth elements? That's exactly what everyone is trying to find so they don't have to rely on China.
Exactly. But the mining laws there are pretty tough, and their geological maps are way out of date. The U.S. Geological Survey just started helping Kazakhstan update those maps.
That's actually a smart move. It's low-key, but really valuable. What about security? With everything going on in Ukraine, are these countries nervous?
They are definitely looking to diversify their defense equipment away from Russia. The U.S. has this state partnership program where they pair Central Asian militaries with various U.S. state National Guards.
Wait, like Virginia is paired with Tajikistan? How does that work?
Yeah, they do military-to-military contact, training for counterterrorism, and disaster prep. It's been surprisingly successful.
That's a weirdly specific way to build a relationship, but I guess it works. I also saw something about a nuclear-free zone.
Yeah, the CAN-NWFC treaty. It basically bans nuclear weapons in Central Asia. The U.S. signed the protocol years ago, but the Senate still hasn't ratified it.
And let me guess, the locals are like, hey, if you want to show you're serious, maybe finish that paperwork.
Precisely. One Kazakh official even called it low-hanging fruit for the U.S. to prove its commitment.
It's always the paperwork. But speaking of commitment, how's the media situation? I imagine Russian propaganda is everywhere.
It's a massive challenge. Russian outlets are still a huge source of news. Meanwhile, local governments are cracking down on independent press.
So it's like a double squeeze, foreign propaganda on one side and government censorship on the other.
Exactly. Even in Kyrgyzstan, which used to be the freest, they're passing laws to block inaccurate information, which really just means stuff the government doesn't like.
It sounds like a really delicate balancing act for all 5 of those countries.
It really is. They're trying to find a middle path between China's money, Russia's influence, and the potential of Western partnerships.
All right, so I've been looking into Central Asia lately, and honestly, it's wild how little we talk about it considering where it's actually located.
Right? I mean, look at its neighbors. You've got Russia to the north, China to the east, and then Iran and Afghanistan to the south. It's basically the ultimate geopolitical crossroads.
Exactly. And there are 5 countries, right? Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. I always get them mixed up.
It's a lot of stands to keep track of, but they cover an area about 40% the size of the U.S. and have roughly 73 million people living there. Most of them are actually under 30, which is a huge demographic shift.
Wait, really? So it's a super young region. Are they all mostly Sunni Muslim too? I think I read that somewhere.
Yeah, the majority religion is Sunni Islam, though there are minorities like Shia Muslims and Russian Orthodox Christians. But even with that shared heritage, the Soviet history there really changed the landscape.
Oh, for sure. They were all part of the Soviet Union until 1991, right? I imagine that left some massive scars, but also some, infrastructure?
Definitely. The report calls it a complex legacy. You've got universal literacy and economic development on one side, but then you have brutal repression and environmental degradation on the other.
And Russian is still a huge deal there, isn't it? Like, even with their own local Turkic and Persian languages?
Absolutely. Russian is still the lingua franca, but what's really interesting is how these countries are trying to forge their own identities now while dealing with these authoritarian governments.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I saw that all 5 countries rank pretty low on democracy and human rights indexes, like they're mostly classified as authoritarian.
Yeah, it's a tough neighborhood for democracy. Political elites still hold a ton of control over the economies, and corruption is a massive hurdle.
Can we dive into Kazakhstan specifically? They seem to be the heavy hitter of the group.
Oh, for sure. Kazakhstan is the most developed by far. It's the world's 9th largest country, literally 4 times the size of Texas.
4 times? That's insane. And they're the ones with all the oil and minerals, right?
Exactly. They've used those resources to really modernize. But politically, it's been dominated by one guy, Nursultan Nazarbayev, since 1991. Even though he resigned in 2019, he's still got this title of Leader of the Nation.
Wait, Leader of the Nation as an actual legal title? That sounds like he's still pulling the strings from behind the curtain.
Pretty much. He has lifelong immunity, and his successor, Tokayev, is seen as a total loyalist. Even the capital city was renamed Nur Sultan in his honor.
That is wild. But is there any pushback, or are people just okay with it because the economy is doing well?
There's definitely pushback, but it's risky. There were these huge protests in 2011 where police actually opened fire on oil workers. And more recently, people have been protesting about land reforms and support for single mothers.
So the stability is kind of fragile. What about the human rights side? I'm guessing it's not great if they're shooting protesters.
It's rough. The State Department points to major issues: no independent judiciary, government surveillance, and severe limits to the media. Reporters Without Borders ranks them 155th out of 180 countries.
Yikes. Okay, but move away from the politics for a second. You mentioned they're energy rich. Just how much oil are we talking?
A lot. Crude oil was about 58% of their exports in 2019. But here's the kicker. They also have 12% of the world's uranium and have been the top producer since 2009.
12% of the world's uranium? I had no idea. No wonder the U.S. is interested.
Right, and the U.S. has actually put over $9 billion into the region over the last 30 years. Our main goal is a stable and prosperous Central Asia that isn't just a puppet of Russia or China.
Which sounds easier said than done, given they're literally sandwiched between them. Russia still has military bases there, don't they?
They do. Russia has strong political and military ties, and China's economic presence is exploding. But people there are actually pretty wary of China.
Is that because of the repression of the Uyghurs? I know Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have ethnic ties there.
Exactly. There's a lot of anger about what's happening in Xinjiang, plus fears that China might start trying to grab territory. It's a really delicate balancing act.
And then there's Afghanistan. With the U.S. withdrawal, things must be getting tense for these neighbors.
Extremely. Most of them are taking a pragmatic approach with the Taliban, trying to maintain stability. But Tajikistan has been much more vocal in their opposition.
Man, it's such a complicated web. It feels like every time we look at one issue, 3 more pop up.
Totally. It's one of the least economically integrated regions in the world, and they still have these lingering border and water disputes from the Soviet era.
It sounds like the U.S. is trying to foster that regional connectivity just to keep the whole thing from boiling over.
That's the hope, but with all these authoritarian leaders and external pressures, it's going to be a long road.
All right, so I've been looking into Kazakhstan lately, and their 2050 strategy is honestly wild. They're aiming to be one of the top 30 most developed economies in the world.
It's incredibly ambitious, right? They're basically trying to pivot the entire country away from just being an oil and gas economy through these massive structural reforms.
Yeah, and they're leaning hard into logistics. I saw they're basically aligning their transport projects with China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. And check this out. They launched the Astana International Financial Center in 2018. It's modeled after the Dubai International Financial Center and backed by Chinese investment. They want to be the financial hub for the whole region.
Wait, and they're also targeting 50% alternative energy by 2050? For a country that's built on extractive industries, that's a huge leap.
It really is. Even the U.S. Department of Commerce is flagging agriculture as a big opportunity for American firms because Kazakhstan is so desperate to diversify.
Speaking of the U.S., I didn't realize we were the first country to recognize their independence back in '91. One general even called the relationship the most mature and forward-thinking in Central Asia.
It's true. A lot of that trust actually goes back to the nuclear issue. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Kazakhstan was left with one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. I'm talking over 1,400 warheads.
1,400? That's terrifying.
Right, but they chose to denuclearize. They worked with the U.S. through the Nunn-Lugar program, and the U.S. ended up providing over $275 million to help them secure the materials and dismantle the silos.
So it's not just about energy, it's a deep security partnership. They even host those Steppe Eagle military exercises with the U.S. Army, right?
Exactly. It's focused on peacekeeping. And they cooperate a lot on counter-narcotics, since Kazakhstan is a major transit route for drugs coming out of Afghanistan. The DEA even has a regional office in Almaty.
Okay, so Kazakhstan is looking stable, but then you look at Kyrgyzstan, or the Kyrgyz Republic, and it feels like a totally different vibe lately.
Yeah, it's been a rough ride. For years, people called it the democracy island of Central Asia because it was so much more open than its neighbors. But in 2021, Freedom House actually downgraded them to not free for the first time in over a decade.
Wait, what happened? I thought they were the only parliamentary democracy in the region.
They were, but they've had these massive political upheavals. In 2020, there were protests over a disputed election, the results were annulled, and this guy, Sattar Japarov, basically seized the moment.
Wait, wasn't Japarov actually in prison when the protests started?
Yes, he was serving time for what he said were political charges. He got released, and within 11 days, he was both the prime minister and the acting president. Talk about a power move.
That is insane. And then he pushed through a new constitution to move back to a presidential system, right?
Yeah, he argued the country wasn't ready for parliamentarism. He won a snap election with 79% of the vote. People seem to love his populist style, even if the international community is worried about democratic backsliding.
And what about the corruption? I saw the U.S. sanctioned a former customs official there, Matrymov.
Right, Reinbek Matrymov. The U.S. put him on the Magnitsky list for money laundering. Japarov says he's fighting crime, but the U.S. Embassy was pretty vocal when Matrymov and a known crime boss, Kolbayov, were released shortly after their arrests.
It feels like there's a lot of theatrical anti-corruption going on. But what's actually keeping the economy afloat?
It's mostly gold and people sending money home. The Kumtor gold mine alone is about 12.5% of their GDP, and roughly 30% of their GDP comes from remittances, mostly from people working in Russia.
So they're super vulnerable to whatever happens in Russia. And what about China? They're neighbors, after all.
China is their biggest trading partner, but it's complicated. China's Export-Import Bank owns almost 40% of Kyrgyzstan's foreign debt. There's been a lot of local pushback against Chinese projects, like that logistics center in Nurin that got canceled after protests.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act. They need the investment, but people are worried about a land grab.
Exactly. And on the human rights side, things are getting tighter, too. Japarov just signed this new law for NGOs that requires all these intense financial reports. The State Department is deeply concerned about it.
It's wild how Kazakhstan is trying to open up and diversify, while Kyrgyzstan, the former democracy island, seems to be pulling back.
It really is a study in contrasts. You have Kazakhstan aiming for the top 30 global economies, and Kyrgyzstan struggling with debt, corruption, and a total overhaul of its political system all at once.
Okay, so we're looking at the Central Asian stands again, specifically Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And honestly, the shift in Kyrgyzstan over the last decade is wild.
It really is. Remember the transit center at Manas? The U.S. used that base for over a decade for operations in Afghanistan, but that closed in 2014 as relations really started to chill.
Right, under President Atambayev. The report mentioned Russian pressure played a big part in that cooling off period.
Exactly. And things got even more tense in 2015 when the U.S. gave a human rights award to Azimjan Askarov. The Kyrgyz government was so upset they actually terminated their 1993 bilateral cooperation agreement.
Wait, they just scrapped the whole deal? That sounds like it would throw all the aid programs into chaos.
You'd think so, but surprisingly, the aid continued. The State Department is actually asking for over $31 million for 2022 to keep working on things like democracy and health. It's a delicate dance.
And then there was that whole visa ban during the Trump administration. Was that really just about passport security?
Mostly, yeah. Kyrgyzstan was slow to adopt biometric passports because of a corruption scandal involving the contract for the booklets. Biden eventually lifted the ban once they got their act together.
It's always a corruption scandal, isn't it? But moving south to Tajikistan, that's a whole different vibe. President Rahman has been in power since 1992.
He's the longest-serving leader in the post-Soviet space, and it's a total family affair. His son, Rustam, is already the Speaker of the Upper Chamber, which puts him first in line for the presidency.
And it sounds like a nepotistic kleptocracy, as Freedom House calls it. But they have a really heavy history there, too. That civil war in the 90s was brutal.
Devastating. Up to 300,000 people died. The government used a peace deal to bring in the opposition, the IRPT, but then they outlawed them as a terrorist organization in 2015.
So they just wiped out the political competition. That explains why Ramon won his 5th term with over 90% of the vote.
Yeah, totally credible elections, right? But the real pressure on Tajikistan right now is the economy. 1/3 of their GDP comes from workers in Russia sending money home.
1/3? That's insane. So if the Russian economy dips, Tajikistan just collapses?
Pretty much. That's why the pandemic was such a hit. Remittances dropped, and suddenly over 40% of people were saying their families had to cut back on food. And while they're struggling, China is stepping in. They now hold the majority of Tajikistan's foreign debt and are even getting stakes in their massive aluminum plant, Talco.
Talco is that huge smelter that uses like 1/3 of the country's electricity, right? While the rest of the country deals with blackouts?
Exactly. They're hoping the Rogun Dam will fix the energy crisis, but that's not slated for completion until 2028. It's a long wait.
Now, Turkmenistan, that's the real mystery of the group. They still claim they've had 0 COVID cases, which nobody believes.
Right? It's one of the most isolated places on Earth. President Berdimuhamedov, or Arkadog as he calls himself, it means the protector, has this massive cult of personality.
It reminds me of the guy before him, Niyazov. It's like they just swapped one leader of the Turkmen for another. Is it true the son is being prepped to take over there too?
Serdar, yeah. He's been rising through the ranks super fast. But despite all the flashy marble buildings in the capital, the country is facing chronic food shortages.
How's that possible? Don't they have some of the biggest gas reserves in the world?
The 4th largest. But they're basically a gas station for China. China built the infrastructure, and now they take most of the gas to pay back the loans. The people see very little of that wealth.
It's like a news black hole, too. I saw the State Department has them as a country of particular concern for religious freedom.
They have for years. They even have state-mandated forced labor for the cotton harvest. Teachers and doctors are basically forced into the fields.
It's heavy stuff. The U.S. keeps engaging, mostly for border security near Afghanistan, but it sounds like a really complicated neighborhood to be in.
Complicated is an understatement. You've got these long-standing autocrats, heavy debt to China, and a huge reliance on Russia. It's a massive balancing act.
Well, that's a lot to process. Definitely gives you a different perspective on that part of the world. Okay, so we're moving on to Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan today. And man, Turkmenistan is just a complete enigma. Like they're famous for this policy of permanent neutrality, right?
Totally. It's not just a vibe. It's actually written into their constitution. The UN even recognized it back in 1995. But in reality, neutrality is kind of their polite word for isolationism. They're basically closed off.
Right, so if they're so closed off, why does the U.S. even bother? I saw we're still sending a few $1 million in assistance there.
It's the classic location thing. They have massive energy resources and a huge border with Afghanistan. General Votel actually told the Senate that even a small security presence there has an outsized impact on countering Russian and Chinese influence.
Wait, outsized impact? How? If they don't want to talk to anyone, what are we actually doing there?
It's very specific stuff. We're talking English language training, medical engagements, and helping their special forces. It's about being a consistent partner in a region where everyone else is trying to move in.
Interesting. So it's like keeping a foot in the door just in case. Now, Uzbekistan feels like the complete opposite story lately, right? Everyone is calling them a potential regional leader.
Exactly. Uzbekistan is the big player. They have the largest population in the region, about 35 million people, and they're the only country that borders every other Central Asian state, including Afghanistan.
That's wild. It's like the geographic heart of the whole area, and they're going through this massive transformation, aren't they? I remember the old president, Karimov, was, well, authoritarian is putting it lightly.
Oh, it was incredibly repressive. Karimov ran the place from 1991 until he died in 2016. He was all about self-sufficiency and keeping the world out. But then Mirziyoyev took over, and honestly, people were shocked by what happened next.
Yeah, because he was Karimov's prime minister for like 13 years. You'd think it would be more of the same.
Right? But he launched this irreversible reform program. He's liberalizing the economy, easing up on political repression, and actually re-engaging with the neighbors. U.S. officials are calling the changes remarkable.
Hold on, irreversible is a big word. Is it actually changing for the average person, or is this just good PR for foreign investors?
It's a bit of both. Freedom House still labels them not free. It's still very much a top-down, centralized system. Mirziyoyev still appoints all the regional governors and judges. So while it's better, it's definitely not a Western-style democracy yet.
But they did close that one prison, right? The really brutal one?
Yes, Jaslik prison. Closing that was huge. They've also released dozens of political prisoners. But, and there's always a but, the UN still gets reports that torture remains widespread in the system.
Man, that's heavy. What about the cotton? I remember hearing stories about how they used to force literally everyone, even kids, to go out and pick cotton.
That's actually one of the biggest success stories. The ILO found that systematic child labor and forced labor basically didn't happen in the 2020 harvest. The government is trying to move away from exporting raw cotton to actually making textiles themselves.
That's a massive shift for their economy. And they have a ton of uranium too, right?
7th largest supplier in the world. They actually have long-term supply deals with the U.S. and China. It's why the U.S. is pushing so hard to help them get into the WTO.
Okay, so we want them in the WTO, but they also just became an observer in that Russia-led economic union. Talk about playing both sides.
It's a tightrope walk. They have a very pragmatic foreign policy, especially with the Taliban. They've positioned themselves as an intermediary to ensure their own security.
It sounds like the U.S. strategy for the whole region is basically just trying to keep these countries from being swallowed up by Russia or China.
That's the core of it. The 2020 U.S. strategy for Central Asia literally says the goal is to help them be free to pursue interests on their own terms. We've put over $9 billion into the region since the 90s to back that up.
$9 billion? That's a lot of sovereignty support. Does that include that weird National Guard program you mentioned once?
Yes, the State Partnership Program. It's actually kind of cool. Uzbekistan is paired with the Mississippi National Guard, and Tajikistan is paired with Virginia. They do training on counterterrorism and disaster prep.
Mississippi and Uzbekistan. That is a pairing I never would have guessed in a million years.
Right? But it builds these long-term military-to-military ties that aren't as scary as a full-blown treaty. It's about being present without being overbearing.
So, looking forward, it seems like Uzbekistan is the one to watch. If they can actually pull off these reforms without sliding back into the old ways, they could change the whole dynamic of Central Asia.
Definitely. If they can balance the economic opening with actual human rights progress, they might just become the regional anchor the U.S. is hoping for.
All right. Well, I think that covers the big picture for these two. It's a lot more complicated than it looks on a map, that's for sure.
Always is. Let's take a break and then we can dive into the regional security stuff.
Okay, so I was digging into this C5+1 thing, and I gotta say, it sounds like a name for a high-stakes poker game or a secret spy ring.
It does, doesn't it? But it's actually much more grounded than that. It's the diplomatic platform the U.S. uses to talk to all 5 Central Asian countries at once.
Right, so Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And they've been doing this since 2015?
Exactly. The idea is to tackle things like security, economic links, and environmental issues together rather than just one-on-one.
But I noticed the material says the region hasn't exactly been a model of cooperation historically. Like, it's one of the least economically integrated places anywhere.
Yeah, that's the big hurdle. After the Soviet Union collapsed, all those old economic links just snapped. You had border disputes, water fights, literally, and restrictive visas that made travel a nightmare.
Wait, didn't that change recently? I saw something about Uzbekistan's new leadership being a knot at the heart of the region that finally untied itself.
Spot on. Since 2016, under President Mirziyoyev, Uzbekistan shifted to this good neighbor policy. Their trade with neighbors shot up by over 100% in some cases.
That's wild. But then you look at the map and see these crazy exclaves in the Fergana Valley. It looks like a jigsaw puzzle gone wrong.
It's a total mess. You have territory from one country completely surrounded by another. The Sokh exclave is ethnic Tajik, but it belongs to Uzbekistan and is surrounded by Kyrgyzstan.
And these were just administrative lines in the Soviet days. They weren't meant to be international borders.
Precisely. Back then, it didn't matter if your farm was technically in another republic. But once they became independent nations, suddenly you're crossing an international border to get groceries.
No wonder there's tension. I read about a fight at a water station in 2021 that actually turned deadly between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Yeah, that was a grim reminder that despite the diplomatic progress, the competition for water and land is still very real and very dangerous.
Speaking of resources, let's talk about the big one, energy. It seems like the whole world wants a piece of Central Asian oil and gas.
Oh, for sure. Kazakhstan is the big player there. I mean, U.S. giants like Chevron and ExxonMobil have been there since the early 90s.
And Turkmenistan is just sitting on a mountain of natural gas, right? But they're landlocked, so they're stuck with pipelines.
Right, and most of that gas is heading to China now. There's been talk for decades about a pipeline to Europe or even down through Afghanistan to India. But those are, well, highly speculative is the polite way to put it.
Yeah, speculative is one word for it, especially with the situation in Afghanistan. That really threw a wrench in everything, didn't it?
Huge. When the Taliban took over in 2021, it forced everyone to rethink. You have Tajikistan being super critical of the Taliban, while Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are being way more pragmatic.
Wait, why the difference? Why is Tajikistan the NMR?
Well, Tajikistan is really pushing for an inclusive government in Kabul that protects the Tajik minority there. They're much more worried about the security spillover.
But Uzbekistan is actually opening up as a power broker. They're even letting aid flow through their railroads.
They are. They've got the only rail link to Mazar-e-Sharif. It's a fine line to walk. They want stability above all else so they can keep their regional integration dreams alive.
I was shocked to read about the Afghan pilots. Like 46 aircraft just fled into Uzbekistan during the collapse?
Yeah, pilots, crews, families, they just took off and landed there. Uzbekistan was in a tough spot because the Taliban wanted the planes back, and the U.S. was basically saying, don't you dare.
So the U.S. eventually moved the people to the UAE, but the planes, like the Blackhawks, are still just there?
As of the report, it's still unclear. It's a bizarre diplomatic limbo for some very expensive hardware.
It's also interesting how the U.S. mission in Afghanistan is temporarily operating out of Almaty now. Kazakhstan is becoming a hub for the UN, too.
It shows how the U.S. strategy is shifting. Since the withdrawal, they're leaning even more on these Central Asian partnerships to keep an eye on things.
So the C5+1 isn't just a talk shop. It's actually becoming the main stage for some pretty heavy-duty geopolitics.
Exactly. From water rights to fleeing pilots, it's all happening there.
Okay, so I was looking into Central Asia recently, and honestly, it's not what I expected. I always hear people talk about it like it's this hotbed for extremism, but the numbers don't really show that.
Right? It's a huge misconception. Between 2008 and 2018, there were only about 19 reported terrorist attacks in the whole region. For such a massive area, that's actually quite rare.
Wait, only 19? That's way lower than the headlines make it sound. But then why do we keep hearing about these strict anti-extremism laws over there?
Well, that's the thing. Critics and human rights groups point out that those governments often use these broadly written laws to basically silence people who disagree with them. It's a way to suppress dissent under the guise of security.
Oh, so it's like a catch-22. The security measures meant to stop radicalization might actually be fueling it.
Exactly. And it gets complicated because there are real concerns, too. You've got the porous border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan where drugs and weapons are smuggled. It's a mess.
I read about that. Didn't some Western cyclists get killed in Tajikistan a few years back?
Yeah, in 2018. The government blamed it on a local political party they'd banned, even though the attackers had literally filmed a video pledging allegiance to ISIS. It shows how murky the official story can get.
That's wild. And speaking of ISIS, I saw something about Central Asian fighters returning from Syria. Is that a big problem?
It's a massive challenge. Thousands of people from the region traveled to Syria and Iraq. Estimates say up to 7,100 people. But here's what's surprising. Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan are actually becoming pioneers in bringing them back.
Wait, pioneers? Most countries are terrified of letting those people back in.
I know, right? But they've repatriated hundreds of their citizens since 2019. The U.S. even called them the tip of the spear for this. Most of the people coming back are women and children, often orphans, and they're focusing heavily on rehabilitation.
That's actually really progressive for a region we usually think of as super authoritarian. But I guess they still have to deal with the Russia and China influence, too.
Oh, absolutely. Russia is still the primary security partner. They provide over 60% of the arms to the region and have military bases in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Most of the military leaders there were actually trained in Russian academies.
So Russia handles the guns and China handles the money?
Pretty much. China is the biggest investor now with their Belt and Road Initiative. But it's not all smooth sailing. There's a lot of xenophobia, actual protests in places like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan over Chinese land reform or the treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang.
I can see why. If your neighbor is that big and starts buying up land, people are going to get nervous. And then there's the safe city stuff.
Yeah, China's exporting their digital surveillance tech. facial recognition, safe city projects to these governments. It's a huge part of what they call the Digital Silk Road.
That sounds like a sci-fi movie gone wrong. But what about the U.S.? Are we just out of the picture now that we're out of Afghanistan?
Not at all. The U.S. is still heavily involved in counter-narcotics since all 5 countries are major transit routes for Afghan heroin. Plus, we're still dealing with some weird old Cold War trade laws.
Wait, like what?
The Jackson-Vanik Amendment. It's this 1974 law originally meant to help Soviet Jews emigrate, but it still technically restricts trade with most of these countries unless the president waives it every year.
Seriously? A law from 1974 is still affecting trade with Uzbekistan today? That's insane.
Right? It shows how slowly the policy wheels turn. But with everything changing in Afghanistan, the U.S. is trying to build new border guard facilities in Tajikistan to keep things stable.
It feels like the region is this constant tug-of-war between Russia, China, and the U.S., while also trying to figure out its own identity after the Soviet Union.
Exactly. They're navigating the legacy of Soviet weapons infrastructure, massive drug trafficking routes, and now high-tech surveillance, all while trying to bring home their citizens from a foreign war. It's a lot.
Man, I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to the news from that part of the world now.
Yeah, it's way more dynamic than people give it credit for. Definitely not just a blank space on the map.
So I was just looking over this data on Central Asia, and man, some of these democracy scores are they're rough.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark reality. If you look at the Freedom House indexes, almost the entire region is categorized as not free.
I noticed Kyrgyzstan specifically. Weren't they usually the exception? But the report shows them dropping from partly free to not free lately.
You're right on the money. They were at a 38 out of 100 in 2016, and by 2021, they slid down to a 28. It's a massive shift for the one country that seemed to be holding on.
Wait, I'm looking at Turkmenistan now? Their democracy score is a 2 out of 100? Is that even possible?
It's about as low as it gets. They actually started at a 4 and somehow managed to go lower. It's essentially total state control.
But then you have Uzbekistan. They actually improved from a 3 to an 11?
Right, and while an 11 is still very much not free, that jump is actually one of the more positive trends in the region, relatively speaking.
So does that political stuff carry over to the economy? Because I'm seeing some different trends there.
Actually, that's where it gets interesting. The economic freedom scores tell a totally different story. Look at Kazakhstan.
Oh, wow. They went from moderately free to mostly free? They're ranked 34th in the world for economic freedom?
Exactly. They're making a huge push to be a global business player, even while their political freedom score stays flat at around 23.
That is such a weird disconnect. It's like come do business here, but don't ask about the elections?
Exactly. Uzbekistan is doing the same thing. They jumped from repressed in 2016 all the way up to mostly unfree by 2021, moving from rank 166 to 108.
Man, that's a huge leap for 5 years. What about corruption? Does the business side help clean that up?
In Kazakhstan, it seems to be helping. They moved from 131st in the world for corruption perceptions up to 94th. That's a significant improvement.
But then you look at Turkmenistan again. They actually dropped in the corruption index from 154th to 165th.
Yeah, they're just trending downward across the board. Even their press freedom is 178th out of 180 countries.
Wait, 178th? There are only 180 countries on the list. Who's even left below them?
Not many. It's basically the bottom of the world for media independence.
And Tajikistan isn't doing much better on press freedom either, right? They fell 12 spots.
Yup, they're down to 162nd. It's a tough environment for journalists there.
I'm noticing that Kyrgyzstan still has the best press freedom rank at 79th, even though their democracy score fell. That's a bit confusing.
It's a bit of a mixed bag. The institutions for media were stronger there, but the overall political climate is clearly tightening up.
What about the rule of law? Kazakhstan seems to be the leader there too, at 62nd.
They are. They improved from 73rd. Uzbekistan is also slightly up, but they're still way back at 92nd.
It really feels like Kazakhstan is trying to distance itself from the rest of the group, at least on paper.
On the economic and legal front, definitely. But the not free label from Freedom House reminds us there's still a long way to go politically.
Yeah, a score of 23 doesn't exactly scream thriving democracy.
Not at all. It's a fascinating, if somewhat grim, set of data to dig through.
Totally. Well, thanks for walking me through this. It's a lot to process.
Anytime. Talk soon.